So a few days ago, I wrote this article, How to Be Rational, and I want to go over this article step by step and provide some additional info. I've recently been having some discussions about how to be rational. Is it possible to know when we're being rational? Is it possible to know when we're being irrational? And I think it is. But there's a problem leading up to this idea of rationality. There's a problem that, generally speaking, we have to grapple with, and that is that we can't generally tell whether our ideas are true. There's no universal criterion that could tell us for any given idea if it's true or not. This is something that both Karl Popper and Alfred Tarski wrote about. Popper wrote about this at length. For some ideas, we know that they're true. Tautologies, we know that by definition they must be true. If you say all tables are tables, that is true. And we know that it's true. Now, our reasoning about this is, of course, going to be fallible. But there is a way to tell, although fallibly though it may be, there is a way to tell that that the fact that all trees are true, the fact that all tables are tables, the sentence all tables are tables is true. But there are some things there are some sentences that are different. There's some knowledge that is different. Our scientific theories, for example, are so vast in implications that we just can't test them all. What we can do, and this is what Popper stressed, there is an asymmetry there. A single false implication taints the entire theory, and then the entire theory is false. So it works that way. But we can't possibly exhaustively test all the implications. So there are certain things where we just can't know. We cannot tell whether or not they're true. Of course, that doesn't mean they can't be true. Some people think it does, but I think that's wrong. Even though I can't tell that they're true, they can still be true. And even though I can't tell that they're true, I can just guess that they are. Okay? We can guess that they're true. And sometimes we're right to guess that they're true, and sometimes we're not. And that's just a reflection of the fact that we're fallible. We don't always get everything right on first try. We don't even always necessarily get everything right on second try. Now, of course, we make mistakes inevitably. At some point, we're going to make mistakes. But the good news is that this is actually an opportunity for progress. We can learn from our mistakes, and we can correct them. We're certainly not, as some people mistakenly think, we're certainly not guaranteed to be wrong. We can guess that an idea is true, and if it is, well, then we're right. And if we guess that an idea is false and is, we're right again. Of course, we could guess that it's true and it's not. Or we could guess that it's false and it's not, right? Those are the four cases. But those are all the possibilities. We can be right in two of them. And the people who think that we're always wrong, no matter how hard we try, I think that's a fundamentally negative view of people and their abilities and of knowledge. And I think we actually get things right all the time. We also get things wrong all the time. But we're not guaranteed to be wrong. The people who think this way, they think they're being fallibilists. That's actually not what fallibilism means. Fallibilism means that, as I said earlier, like the deepest reason for the fallibility of man is that there's no general criterion of truth. If there were, then we wouldn't be fallible. Then we could. Our reasoning about such a criterion actually would still be fallible. But it certainly doesn't help, right? It certainly doesn't help things along that there is no such criterion. It'd be easier if there were. And so fallibilism means we might be right or we might be wrong. And in most cases, we can't tell either way. We just have to guess. Cynicism says, no, we are wrong, and we know for sure that we're wrong, and we will always be wrong no matter how hard we try. Even if we make progress, we're always going to be. Even in a single idea, you can find a mistake and correct it, but even after you correct it, that single idea is still going to be wrong. You might not know where, but you're always going to be wrong, no matter how hard you try. But that's the reason that's not fallibilism is it would mean that you can know for sure that you're wrong, and you can't know that. It would basically be the inverse of a criterion of truth, and that can't exist. Anyway, so we can learn from our mistakes. But many people are disappointed to learn that there's no universal criterion of truth because their understanding of rationality depends on it. They think without such a criterion, and it's because, and they have good reason for this. I mean, they want to act rationally. They want the world to make sense. They want to be able to learn about the world, and they want the world to be accessible to reason. And so they think if there is no such criterion of truth, well, then the world is not accessible to reason. And conversely, if there were such a criterion, well, then we should, as a rule, prefer true ideas over false ones, right? That would be the rational choice. It wouldn't be the whole story. It wouldn't help you every time, because there are cases where we would prefer a deep falsehood over a trivial truth. This is something Popper always stressed. You know, Newtonian physics, we know this now. We've known this for over 100 years now. Newtonian physics is, strictly speaking, false as a description of reality. But in certain contexts, it is still tremendously useful, and it is certainly more useful than a tautology, such as all tables are tables. Now, all tables are tables is true. Newtonian physics is false, strictly speaking, but you can't really do much. You can't really make much of all tables are tables. Okay, now what? But you can do a lot with Newtonian physics. Okay. Now, but even though there is no such criterion of truth, there is still a way to be rational. And this is extremely good news. Okay, this is very exciting because, and there's even a way to tell whether we're being rational. So when it comes to truth, we're in a bit of a precarious situation. In many cases, we just have to guess because we can't tell. But in rationality, not only can you be rational, you can even tell that you're being rational. And you can always tell. It's always possible, right? I'm not saying you're guaranteed to know, but it's always possible to know. You can know whether some course of action is rational. That's a domain of moral philosophy, right? And more generally, in the space of all ideas, you can tell whether or not adopting some idea is rational. That's a domain of epistemology. It won't let me highlight it. Epistemology is a fancy word for a theory of knowledge, you know, the study of under what conditions knowledge grows, under what conditions it doesn't grow. Popper would say creating the conditions that help us correct errors. Others would say, how can we justify our knowledge? How can we make sure that we know it to be true? Which, as I just said, that's not possible, so I would stay away from that. Anyway, but rationality is obviously also a big part of epistemology. And this criterion of rationality, this way to tell whether or not we're being rational that I have in mind, works for any idea. Okay, and this, again, is great news because it means we don't actually need a criterion of truth anyway. We can still be totally rational. And this idea that we want to be rational is so central, because if you want to make progress in life, if you want your life to get better, if you want to, let's say, if you want to be healthier, if you want to be smarter, if you want to make more money, in all of these areas, you need to be rational. Now, that's not a guarantee of success, but you're certainly more likely to succeed in these areas if you're being rational than otherwise. Okay, but to be rational, you need some sort of way to error correct, right? You need some way to tell when you're not being rational. That's not a big deal. We're not perfect. Like I said, we're all fallible. We're going to make mistakes, and that includes our attempts to be rational too. You can fall off the horse. If you fall off the horse, just get back on again. That's fine. But you have to have a way of knowing that you've fallen off the horse when it comes to rationality. And we have that now. And I'll tell you in a minute what it is. Okay. So the question changes from, how can I know that I'm adopting true ideas, which we can't know, to how can I know that I'm adopting ideas rationally? And that is something that we can know. Okay. So this criterion of rationality, it has two parts. First, it's rational to adopt an idea if it has no pending criticisms, and it's rational to reject an idea if it does have pending criticisms. It's very simple. Anybody can understand this. It's very simple. In fact, indeed, we should adopt an idea with no pending criticisms, because if there are no pending criticisms, well, that means that we have no reason to reject it. Conversely, we should reject an idea with pending criticisms, because when a criticism is still pending, then that means that no one has addressed it, not successfully. And if no one successfully addressed it, then we can't just ignore and advocate the criticized idea anyway. It means that there's some pending problem with it. And if we're honest, if we're truth-seeking, if we're thorough and conscientious, we can't just ignore that. And those are all key virtues that contribute to rationality. Now, what is the definition of a pending criticism? A criticism is pending if it itself has no pending criticisms in turn. Right? So this is where it gets a little more technical. I'm borrowing this term in a deeply nested fashion. I'm borrowing this from programming. This is a common phrase in programming. I'll get into more of what this means in a little bit. Or should I do it now? Let's see. I'll get into it in a little bit. But we'll return to this more technical notion of what it means for a criticism to be pending. For now, it just means a criticism that hasn't been addressed. Nobody has an answer to it. Okay. Now, of course, with Popper, we hope to find not just true ideas, because again, if that was our goal, we could just list tautologies all day. We want to find interesting truth. We want to find deep truth. We want to find new and groundbreaking explanations about the world. Okay, and to do that, not only do we propose new ideas and guess new ideas, but we're critical of these ideas. We criticize ideas if we're not able to do it ourselves, and somebody else might be happy to do it. And then if a criticism is right, well, then we can reflect that by revising our ideas accordingly. If you have an idea and somebody criticizes it and you say, well, you know what, you were right about that, I should change my idea. And so then you revise it accordingly. Or if you say, well, somebody criticized my idea, but actually I think they were wrong about that, you can address the criticism. That's another way to say you can counter-criticize it. Not every criticism is automatically right. So what's important here is that this notion that we should be critical applies not just to our ideas, but even to the criticisms themselves. And some of you might feel like this is where this notion of deep nesting comes in now, and we'll get to that. Okay. Now, what's interesting here, and this again ties in with this Popperian idea that sometimes a false idea might be preferable to a true one. Right? Because a false idea, it might be false, but it might be very useful. So I think I mentioned Newtonian physics earlier. Right? It's strictly speaking false as a description of reality. But if you're a teacher in a classroom and you just want to calculate the trajectory of a bowling ball, say, then it's actually really, really useful, and it'll still give you accurate results. I mean, I'm not a physicist, but that's my understanding. Whereas I'm told that Newtonian physics is hopelessly inaccurate when it comes to calculating the trajectory of the orbit around a black hole or something like that, okay? But Einstein's equations are fantastic for that. But let's say Einstein's equations are way more complicated. I don't know if they are for a fact, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Einstein's equations are more complicated. Right? It'd be unreasonable to use Einstein's equations in a classroom for the simple purpose of calculating the trajectory of a bowling ball. Then it is rational to adopt Newtonian physics in that context, because knowledge is contextual. It's rational to adopt Newtonian physics in that context, okay? Even though we know that Newtonian physics is false. Okay, so now what we want in our aim for deep, interesting, groundbreaking truth, we want the number of ideas with no pending criticisms to grow. And we also want the overlap between the set of true ideas and the set of ideas with no pending criticisms to grow as well. This is our criterion of progress. So not only do we have a criterion of rationality, we get with it for free a criterion of progress. Did I say that twice? We not only have a criterion of rationality, we get with it for free a criterion of progress. Now, in this idea that we want these two sets to overlap, you may notice a similarity with Popper's concept of verisimilitude there. But there were some flaws with verisimilitude. I don't actually think we need it. Popper proposed this idea of verisimilitude or truth-likeness because he wanted to rehabilitate this intuitive notion that as we make progress, as we propose better and better theories, some of them get closer to the truth than others. And there were some problems with that, and he wanted to rehabilitate that concept. It didn't actually end up being successful because David Miller and Pavel Tichy, I might be mispronouncing that second name wrong, proved independently, I think in 1974, that Popper's more technical definition of verisimilitude doesn't actually work out. It leads to a contradiction. Anyway, my understanding is that since then, some new approaches to verisimilitude have emerged that don't have that flaw. I don't think we need it. We could simply say, so Popper wanted it to be an answer to when you're faced with a situation where all known ideas are false, and you can't come up with any new ideas, but you still want to be able to proceed rationally. What can you do then? And this is where he said, well, you can go with the one that has greater verisimilitude. You can go with the one that's closer to the truth, or you can go with the one that's better corroborated, the one that has passed more severe tests. If you have two theories and one cannot pass some of the tests that the other one can pass, then you go with the one that can pass them, right? That would be the rational choice. Even if you have other reasons to reject the theory, it's just currently you can't do anything else. I think we don't need verisimilitude. The reason I don't think we need it is you could simply say, well, if a theory doesn't pass a severe test, that's a pending criticism. And we already said that we can't advocate ideas with pending criticisms. So I think this need for verisimilitude goes away, but again, I think it maybe it lives on as an approximation, as Popper would say, as a very very remote approximation. Let's say there's some similarity there in this idea that we, as a criterion of progress, we want the overlap between the set of true ideas and the set of ideas with no pending criticisms to grow. Of course, this whole approach only works if we're open to criticism, if we make our ideas vulnerable to criticism, if we immunize them against criticism. I think that's Hans Albert's phrase. Then it's no surprise if they have no pending criticisms, right? It'd be a bit like saying if you post something on X and then you change the settings so that nobody can comment or criticize it, it'd be a bit like saying, well, see, no, I can rationally adopt this idea because nobody's criticized it. Well, no, the reason nobody's criticized it, you made it so that nobody could criticize it, right? So that would obviously not work. Okay, now let's get into this more technical notion of pending criticisms. But it is so simple, although we are getting more technical here, it is so simple, I think, that any computer science freshman could program it. We can trivially program a computer to compute whether or not an idea has pending criticisms at the current state of a discussion. As long as we feed the ideas into the computer and tell the computer which ideas are criticisms, it can do the rest. So let's open this link here, and then we can say, and I've published this code. It's, again, very simple, 11 lines. If you don't count the white space, it's really only 9. 3 very simple programs published under the MIT license. This is Ruby code, which the benefit of Ruby code is it reads almost like natural language English. But basically, what these 3 little programs do, starting at the top, we say, okay, we have this program that tells us for a given idea, we give it some idea, right? And then it tells us whether or not we should adopt it. Okay, how cool is that? And it does this by looking at whether or not this idea has any pending criticisms and making sure that there are none. Okay, how does it do that? Okay, so here we have the second program. This is what the first one calls. It says, it gives it that same idea, and it says, hey, does this idea have any pending criticisms? Now, to determine whether or not it has any pending criticisms, it looks at all of the criticisms of that idea, and we get those down here. The criticisms are just the so-called children of an idea, basically the comments. We're in a tree, and this is one of the ways to denote that something comes further down the tree, further down the branches, as you call those children. And then the idea is the parent. And of the children, we just say, okay, which ones are criticisms, right? And then we get that here. And then we say, of those criticisms, we consider those pending that we should adopt. A criticism is pending if we should adopt it. Why wouldn't it let me? Okay, it's not letting me highlight it anymore. There it is. Oh, weird. A criticism is pending if we should adopt it. Okay, now you might say, oh, but Dennis, doesn't that mean that we're defining these first two programs in terms of each other? We should adopt an idea if it has no pending criticisms, but it has no pending criticisms if there are no criticisms that we should adopt? That sounds circular, doesn't it? So you might ask, doesn't that lead to either a vicious cycle or a vicious infinite regress? Because if these first two programs just keep calling each other, it's never going to stop, right? But the answer is no, that's actually not the case, because in this tree, we're enforcing, let me show you. We'll go to how does Veritula work, because I actually have a drawing here. Here we go. This is what such a discussion tree might look like. This is what a state of a discussion might look like. Okay, so we have some idea, doesn't matter what the content is, it could say the sky is blue, and who cares? Okay, but in this example state of the discussion, it has three criticisms, C11, C12, and C13. Now, if that was all, if there was nothing else underneath, then we could say, okay, this idea has three pending criticisms. All right. Now, it doesn't actually, though, and the reason is that C11 is not actually a pending criticism because it itself has been criticized twice. C11 actually has two pending criticisms. This is why C11 is not pending, so it doesn't count toward the number of pending criticisms for I. C12, however, is a criticism that does not have any pending criticisms itself. Note, it doesn't have any descendants. It doesn't have any children. So C12 is a pending criticism of I. Now C13 is a more interesting case, because C13 does have a counter criticism, so you might think it's not pending, just like C11, because C11 also was criticized with these two counter criticisms. Now, C13 does have a counter criticism, C23, but that has itself been counter criticized by C31 and C32. This is why it's so important to go through all of these ideas in a deeply nested fashion. Okay, so this is why if C23 is currently criticized, it has two pending criticisms, then it itself cannot count as a pending criticism of C13 anymore. And this is why C13 in turn is a pending criticism of I. So the leaves of the tree, C21, C22, C12, C31, and C32, if they're criticisms, they're always going to be pending, as long as they're leaves. If a criticism is not a leaf, well, then you have to check, does it have any pending criticisms in turn? And if it has criticisms, you need to check if those are pending in turn. And so you have to go down the list. But importantly, as to this question of, is there an vicious infinite regress here? No, there is not. If we want to check, does I have pending criticisms, there's a finite number of ideas here. This is what, not even 10, 4, 6, less than 10 ideas, right? So no, at most we're gonna traverse these ideas, and that's it. So there's no infinite regress here. And that we can enforce that by saying that there's no circularity because no idea is ever allowed to point back at itself, neither directly nor by way of other ideas. And we're enforcing the strict hierarchy, right? So the technical term for this is a directed acyclic graph. There's a hierarchy. This is not like a graph in a social network where if two people are friends, you draw a connection between them, but there's no hierarchy between them. They're just friends. Here, there's a hierarchy. There's a parent-child relationship. There's an order to these things, and this is why we can enforce this kind of no circularity. We can enforce that there's no circularity. And again, since there's always a finite amount of ideas in any discussion tree, there's no vicious infinite regress either. All right, so this is why our recursive epistemology makes sense here. This is how this works. It's really deceptively simple, I think. I mean, who would have thought that you can have a computer tell you whether or not advocacy of some idea is rational in 11, really 9 lines of code? How cool is that? Okay, anyway. So again, we can program a computer to tell us if we provide the ideas and we tell it which ideas are criticisms of which, then it can tell us, using those 9 lines of code, which ideas we can rationally adopt and which we should reject. Now, this is one of the reasons I say that serious epistemologists in the 21st century are programmers, because they need to be able to program stuff like that. And I've written an article about this on my blog, one of my blogs, libertythroughreason.com, that in the 21st century, professional epistemologists, one of the job requirements is you need to be able to code. Not vibe code, hand code. You need to be a professional programmer, or your programming skills should be that of a professional programmer. Now you might say, well, Dennis, I mean, that's ridiculous. Does that mean that, Karl Popper and Ayn Rand were not serious epistemologists? No, for their time, they were. They were absolutely serious epistemologists. Because, Popper was born in 1902, I think. He died in 1994. And Rand was a contemporary. I think she was born in 1904, 1905. Don't quote me on it. And then she died in the 80s, I think. So personal computing wasn't really a thing until the 1970s, right? And so they can be forgiven, right? It just wasn't their time yet. But for us today, personal computers are everywhere. Everybody has a computer. Everybody has a smartphone, right? Very common. It's never been easier to learn to code. There are plenty of free resources, right? People really have no excuse. The prerequisites change, right? You could be on the cutting edge of math in the year 1000 without knowing calculus, because calculus wasn't a thing yet. But back in the late 18th century, whenever Leibniz and Newton came up with it, then you couldn't be on the bleeding edge of math anymore. You had to know calculus. And I think there's such a thing in epistemology happening as well. Or it's just like... you used to be able to be a cosmologist just by being a philosopher. Cosmology used to be a branch of physics. But now it's it used to be a branch of philosophy, but now it's a branch of physics. You cannot be a cosmologist without being a physicist. And this is the same thing in epistemology now. You cannot be an epistemologist without knowing how to code. A moral philosopher's job in particular is to build beautiful user interfaces to communicate ideas, because not everybody is a moral philosopher, right? We have division of labor. Some people are not interested in that. Still, they might be interested in making rational decisions. They might want to be rational. They just don't want to program the tools. And so the moral philosopher's job in society is to build those beautiful user interfaces that help the average Joe make rational decisions. This is why I built Veritula. This is why Veritula.com, Veritula.com. That's why I built this. I'm an epistemologist, and I embrace that role that I have. I mean, I'm also a programmer. I was a programmer before I became an epistemologist, so maybe I had it easier. I didn't need to learn that on top of things. But regardless, this is my job. My job is to build user interfaces. Not just write books. It can be that too, but this traditional job description of a epistemologist, that he just writes books or whatever, that needs to change. He can still do that, but he needs to write code. I want to see code. Now the cool thing, since we can, and I forgot to mention this earlier here, the cool thing about the fact that we can program a computer to tell us whether we're being rational or not, is that we don't have to remember all those ideas anymore. We can just put them into the computer. We can put them in a database, and we can just store them there. And then the computer, no matter how many ideas there are, the computer can tell us whether or not we can rationally adopt or reject them. And as a result, this catalog of ideas can be vast. It can be much bigger than any one man could hold in his mind. And that is really important because memory is so error-prone. We shouldn't rely on memory to see which ideas we should adopt or reject. But this happens all the time, where people, they have a discussion and they have the same discussion over and over again. And basically the kind of measure by which they proceed is, well, what's the word I'm looking for? The other party. The other party made some good points. I made a lot of good points. Who's to say, really, who won the debate? Sometimes it's clear. If it's an overwhelming victory, it's clear. But generally speaking, I think people maybe overestimate their ability to keep track of which ideas have been addressed and which haven't. And this is why they have to have the same discussions over and over. It happens all the time. I have a discussion with somebody. I address all their objections because I hold myself to the standard. They can't address all my objections. The conversation stops. Maybe they even temporarily agree for the moment. The discussion stops. 2 months later, we talk about the same thing again, and it's as if the first discussion never happened. It's not only extremely frustrating, it's counter to this idea of rationality, like more deeply. Forget if it feels frustrating or not. It's maybe not even that important, but more deeply, it's counter to this idea of rationality and that there should be a rhyme and a reason to which ideas we adopt. If we could just randomly forget things, now we're just acting on whim again, right? And sometimes people conveniently forget certain things too. So anyway, memory is too error prone. We shouldn't rely on it, right? Ideally, if this thing happens, right, and if you're aware that maybe, or you could, if you're aware that something's been discussed on Veritula, or you maybe you don't know, but you can just check, right? You can check if something's been discussed on Veritula. You just go to veritula.com, veritula.com, right? And then you can check one of the discussions here. This one's fatalism versus cynicism. There's a bunch of discussions on here. There's the brain and computer. This is something that people discuss all the time, right? All the time. Is abortion moral? Some people discuss all the time. Now here on the homepage, there's only like a few discussions that are being presented there. The list of all discussions is going to be here. Okay, so we have way more here. But anyway, if we go to the specific topic of abortion, let's say, right? Oh, what happened there? That might be a bug. I need to fix that. But if we go to the specific topic of abortion, think of all the literally millions of times people have debated this topic. How much progress have they really made? I don't know. Who knows? There's no way to keep track of it, right? But now there is. Because you can simply go to Veritula and you can look it up. So I and some friends, we had an extensive discussion. It's always my name because I summarized their stances, but it's from different people. We had an extensive discussion about abortion with all the religious argument, the evictionist argument, all the different arguments, okay? Basically everything's here. I mean, there might be some other arguments that I haven't thought of yet, right? And then that could be reflected in the future. But as of right now, you can see how long this discussion went on, right? That we really tried to cover this from every angle. And then as long as you feed the ideas into it and you tell the site which ideas are criticisms of which other ideas, it can tell you. And we came to this conclusion. Now, whether or not this conclusion is true right now, and abortion itself is not really the issue here. This is out of scope for this video. But my point is that you can just go and look it up. And so here, for example, the idea was that you should be able to abort until the 3-week mark because of certain reasons related to the nervous system. Okay, I'm not going to go into those here. Now, you can look it up later, or you can pause the video and read it now. But and this idea doesn't have any pending criticisms. It was criticized extensively. People tried, right? So it says here, there's a criticism of this parent idea, right? This larger idea. There was one criticism. There was another criticism. Yet another criticism, right? 4, 5, 6. And so this is how we see this tree, right? You see this nesting? This reflects that tree structure. So we have these deeply nested criticisms, and the app simply tells you, oh, well, this was a criticism of that idea that I showed earlier about the nervous system, but it itself has 3 pending criticisms. This is why it doesn't count toward the criticisms for this idea. There are this whole idea has no pending criticisms, otherwise there'd be a red label next to this battle-tested thing. The fact that it's battle-tested just means it's kind of an analog of Popper's concept of well-corroborated. It just means that it has survived a bunch of criticisms. Okay. It also means that if somebody wanted to criticize this idea, either they would have to rehabilitate one of the many criticisms that failed, or they would have to come up with a new criticism. And so we can pinpoint precisely what has to happen to either rehabilitate or put to bed an idea. So not only do we get a like I said, a criterion of rationality, we also get a criterion of progress. We also get a criterion of objectivity, by the way. Because whether I personally am in favor of abortion or not is not even really the issue, right? I can go to Veritula and I can say, well, maybe I'm well informed on the issue of abortion. Maybe I'm not. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter, strictly speaking, that I was the one who submitted this idea right here. I just happen to be the author. It doesn't necessarily mean that I personally agree with it. It just means this idea has no pending criticism, so we can adopt it. It'd be very cool if a policymaker looked at this and understood the purpose of something like this and knew that this is a superior way to find truth than voting, right? But in any case, this is an objective advocacy of this idea because I have an objective reason to advocate it. It's again like you could be a judge. I forget if I said this earlier. For a specific example, where a judge looks up a law in a legal text, and the judge might personally disagree with the law, right? So let's say it's like a drunk driving case, okay, and he has to try the case, and he has to find a a just verdict. So he looks up the law. Okay, now he personally might not like the law. Maybe he thinks the law is too strict, or maybe he thinks the law is not strict enough. But it doesn't matter. His personal, my understanding, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that there are cases or scenarios where judges are given some discretion, right? But let's say that there are like minimum sentencing guidelines, right? That it doesn't matter what the judge personally thinks. It doesn't matter if the judge personally thinks that drunk driving is no big deal. It'd be a wild stance to hold, but whatever, right? But it doesn't matter. All that matters is he just looks it up and then acts accordingly. The courtroom is not the place to change this stuff. That would come later. That's the execution of the knowledge that you already have, right? Anyway, I don't think there's any other site like Veritula. I'm not aware that there's any site that can tell you when you're being rational or not. And this is also great because now you can hold people accountable. You can say, hey, look, man, this is what's rationally adoptable right now. So this is what you should be doing. Or you can say, well, you submitted these ideas. This is what you said you would do, and now you're not doing it. What's up with that? So that works. So you can hold public intellectuals accountable that way. You could imagine that as you read a book, you can summarize it, you put it up on Veritula, and you can start criticizing it. And then you can send it to the author and say, hey, look, man, I have these criticisms. I don't think they've been addressed. And then they can reply. And there's a central place where people can find the current state, the cutting edge state of the discussion. How cool is that? Now, some people don't like this. And I found, I was surprised, actually, that they came from some of my own people almost. The Popperians, well, I guess they're not really Popperians strictly. I guess they're more Deutschians. But, I mean, I should say for clarity, David Deutsch has also greatly influenced me. But they have a kind of aversion to this idea that we could program a computer to be rational for us. That's not really what it is, right? I'm not saying the computer is being rational for us. That we could program a computer to tell us whether we're being rational or not. But for the reasons I've explained, I think we can. Now, this was actually part of a discussion that I fed into Veritula earlier. Let me see here. I think it was in here somewhere. Was it in here? Wait. Because I had a discussion with Brett Hall. Oh, wait. Do need that. Wasn't that one. Here we go. right. And so Brett said, quote, rational decision-making is not a matter of pulling a lever and cracking through a calculation. What he's referring to here is at the beginning of Infinity, chapter 13, which is all about rational decision-making. And David Deutsch makes a point, I think he's right to make that point. I actually partially agree here. He's right to make that point that current accounts of rational decision-making focus too much on choosing from already existing options according to a fixed formula. And they discount our ability, our uniquely human ability to come up with new options, specifically common preferences. Common preferences are a really important concept in Deutsche epistemology. But so I think Brett is his heart's in the right place, because he's saying, look, man, like this Deutsche insight is really important. Creativity is really important. But I think the mistake he's making is that he thinks creativity and rationality are synonymous. So he says the whole Popperian view is that rationality is creativity, the correction of corrections and errors once identified. But that's not true. That's not true. And basically, I think there's several things wrong with it. And we can see that here now, right? So without even getting into them, we can see, okay, Brett's stance currently has 5 pending criticisms, right? That's what it says here. And this is how we know that we cannot rationally continue to advocate it. If he followed this, he would have to drop it, at least temporarily. Or if he wasn't personally convinced, then he could say something like, well, I personally think this, but at the current state of the discussion, this is a contentious view. Right? I think that would be fair to phrase it like that. That would be an honest reflection of what's going on. Okay, but I think one of the things that's wrong with it is it's creativity and rationality are not the same. One reason is that, so here, for example, here's a reason. Popper, right? I mean, Brett attributes his view to Popper, but it's actually misattribution. This is actually not Popper's view. That creativity and rationality are the same, because Popper, I mentioned earlier, these notions of corroboration and verisimilitude, Popper suggested those for rational preference formation given a set of already created theories. Right? So this is not, Brett thinks he's representing the Popperian view here, but he's not. Okay. Ben Davies pointed out to Brett that the step of conjecturing ideas is not itself rational or irrational. Rationality comes in when it comes time to decide what to do, given your state of knowledge. And then that discussion went on for a while. Okay. Does this continue here? Let's see. So anyway, you can see that if I tried to remember all this, by the way, right, it would be too much. Nobody can remember all of this. I could maybe remember all the ideas, but I'm not going to remember off the top of my head how they related to each other. Okay, but anyway, I can't find it right now. But another issue with that stance that rationality is creativity, is it's so clearly not, because, for example, we can creatively come up with reasons or with ways to suppress criticism, say. That's an irrational thing to do, but we can creatively come up with ways to do that. We can creatively come up with reasons not to face some inconvenient truth, let's say. Right? We can come up with excuses, we can come up with evasions. Those are still acts of creativity, but they're irrational. Now, that is not to say that creativity is not an important part of rationality. It is, but creativity is you can use it rationally or you can use it irrationally. It's not automatically rational. It's not the same thing. Now, it is true that of course, rationality, if a big part of it is creativity, then we can't fully automate it. And so, again, I'm somewhat sympathetic to Brett's view that, where he said that we can't just pull a lever. Here, rational decision-making is not a matter of pulling a lever and cracking through a calculation. Now, so it is true, there's creativity in there too, right? But then all the remaining parts are a matter of pulling a lever and cracking through a calculation. Like, basically what you can do as a programmer is you just outsource all the creative parts to the user, right? You prompt the user for creative input. This is why Veritula prompts the user for ideas, and it prompts the user to tell Veritula whether or not the idea is a criticism. But that's it. Those are the creative parts, and then everything else can be done automatically. And so then why not do that? So anyway, so this is why I don't share some of the Deutschian's misgivings about programming rationality. I think this is actually really exciting news. We not only can we be rational, we can know that we're being rational, we can know that we're not being rational, and this gives us an error correction mechanism. And even better than that, we can program a computer to tell us when we're being irrational. I think this is a very exciting development that people should be aware of. If you like this kind of stuff, follow me on X, Dennis Hackathal. If you want to practice rationality, go on Veritula, veritula.com. We'd love to have you. We're always looking for more people interested in rationality. Or read my blog, libertythroughreason.com.